Hello guys, you're welcome to another tutorial on SewWithAby channel. In today's video, I'll be sharing how to cut and sew this underbust corset. This tutorial is beginners friendly and well detailed. So if this is what you would like to learn, then keep watching. Let's get into the video. For this tutorial, here are the materials I'll be working with. This is boning and this is stay. It will be used to interface the fabric. This is lining, it is 1 yard, and for my fabric I have African print here and it is also 1 yard. Now I'll be drafting my pattern on a pattern paper before transferring to my fabric, and this is the pattern paper I'll be working with. I'll draw out a basic bodice first before modifying it into an underbust corset. At the top of my pattern paper, I'll draw a straight line which will serve as the shoulder or the starting line, and from there I'll take my vertical measurement. The first vertical measurement is my bust line, which is 9.5 inches, my underbust 13 inches, the waistline 16 inches, and the length I want it to be, which is 23 inches. Then I'll draw straight lines across the points. Then I will label the lines. This is the bust line, the underbust line, the waistline, and the full length line. The next thing to do is to take the neck measurements. Although it's not necessary for the underbust pattern, I only want to measure it because I'm drafting a basic bodice first. The width is 3 inches and the depth is 3 inches. Then I'll take my shoulder measurement. My shoulder measurement divided by 2 plus ½ inch sewing allowance, and from that point I'll come down by 1 inch for the shoulder slope. And from the shoulder slope I'll measure my armhole depth. To get that, you divide your round bust by 6, then you add 1.5 inches to it. Now this is the chest line. The next thing to do is to get the armhole curve. On the chest line I'll measure my round bust divided by 4, and on the armhole line I'll get the midpoint, and from that point I'll go in by ½ inch. Then I'll connect the points together. Now I will come to the bust line to measure my bust span divided by 2. My bust span is also my nipple to nipple measurement. Divided by 2 is 3.5 inches, and I'll mark that 3.5 inches all the way to the hem line. Then connect the points. On the waistline, I'll measure my dart. The width is 1.5 inches. I'll divide that into 2, then mark it on either side of the line. At the hem, I'll come up by 1.5 inches. And on the bust line, I'll come down by 1 inch. Then I'll connect the dart. The next thing to do is to take the round measurements. I already measured my bust circumference, so I'll come to the waistline to measure my waist circumference divided by 4, then replace the 1.5 inches for the dart. And on my hem line, I'll measure my hip circumference divided by 4. Then I'll connect the points together. Now that I have drafted a basic bodice pattern, I'll proceed to work on the corset pattern. But then, you don't necessarily have to draft a basic bodice before drafting out your underbust corset pattern, because the measurements you need to work with are the underbust, the waist, and your desired length measurements. So guys, let's create the underbust corset pattern. And to start with, I'll measure the length I want my corset to be. Now at the center front of the underbust line, I'll come up by ½ inch. You can use 1 or 1.5 inches, depends on how high you want the center front of your corset to be. Then I'll connect the points back to the underbust line. Next, I'll come to the side, and from the waistline I'll come down by 3.5 inches, and at this side I'll come down from the waistline by 5 inches. Then connect the points. This is how long I want my corset to be. Go ahead and determine how long you want yours, okay? The next thing to do is to divide the corset into 4 panels. and each panel will be about 1.5 inches wide. Now from the center front on the waistline, I'll go in by 1.5 inches. I'll mark the same thing on the underbust line as well as the hem line. Then I'll connect the points together. For the next panel, I'll measure 1.5 inches from the dart. Then I'll measure another dart width, which is 1 inch. Next, I'll divide that 1 inch into 2. Then I'll connect the middle point into a straight line. I will also connect my dart. So guys, we've successfully divided this corset into 4 panels, and this is all for the drafting of the front corset pattern. I'll go ahead to cut it out. After cutting, the next thing to do is to label the panels. This is the center front. I will also label it number 1, then the next one 2, 3, and 4. And at the lower part, I will draw an arrow facing down, indicating this is the lower part. Then I'll come back to the top here and label this again as the side front. Go ahead and label your panels whichever way you will understand. The next thing to do is to draft the back pattern, and when I'm done drafting the back pattern, I will cut out the front panels. For the back, I already drafted the basic pattern without including the underbust line because there's no bust at our back. But what I will do is to measure the difference from the waistline to the underbust line on the front pattern so as to mark the same thing on the back pattern. And the difference here is 3 inches. So I'll mark the same thing. From the waistline, I'll go up by 3 inches, and at the center back, I'll measure the same thing. Then connect the points. For the length, I'll use the same measurements I used at the front, which is 3.5 inches at this side and 5 inches at this side. And I'll also connect the points. The next thing to do is to divide the corset into panels like I did the front pattern. I will also be dividing it into 4, but the center back panel will be cut off because this is a corset and we want it snatched. So from the center back, I went in by 1.5 inches, then I'll connect the points. And I will mark this panel to indicate that it will be cut off. For the next panel, I'll measure 1.5 inches from the dart, and from that point, I'll measure 1 inch for the dart width and divide that 1 inch into 2, then connect the middle point into a straight line and also connect the dart. So guys, this is all for the drafting of the back pattern. I'll go ahead to cut it out. And I will also label each panel. Please do not forget to label your panels. The next thing to do now is to cut out the panels of each pattern. Now the difference between these two patterns is that for the front pattern, I went up from the underbust by ½ inch, and the front panels are 4, not 3 like the back. I'll go ahead now to cut it out. After cutting, the next thing to do is to transfer this pattern to my fabric. Now this is my fabric and I already ironed interfacing to it, and I did the same thing to my lining. This will save me the stress of having to cut and iron interfacing to each of the panels. To cut out my pattern, I'll place my fabric on the lining as I'll be cutting the two together, then arrange my pattern on it. I added sewing allowance on all sides of the panel. I'll go ahead now to cut. After transferring the pattern, the next thing to do is to start stitching, but before then, I will notch the top part of each panel. Then I will set the back panels aside to work on the front. I will unpin the pattern paper, the first two, and set it aside. Now, I will pin the main fabric of the center front as well as the lining. Then I will arrange each of the side fronts accordingly. I will set it side by side, then pin it together. I'll be doing the same to the lining off camera. So guys, this is what you should have after pinning, and this is what my lining looks like. For the back panel, I will pin the main fabric of the center back together, although I'll still unpin it, and I'll do the same to the lining. Then I will arrange the side back accordingly and pin it together just like I did the front. Then I will unpin the center back, and this is what you should have for your back panels. I will head over to the sewing machine now to stitch using the allowance I left for it while cutting. So guys, after stitching, this is what I have. I opened up the seam of my lining before ironing, but I didn't do the same thing to the main fabric because I want my boning to be on one side of the seam, and this is what it looks like at the right side. For the front piece, I did the same thing. I opened up the seam of the lining and I ironed the seam of the main fabric to one side, and this is what it looks like at the right side. The next thing to do is to join the side of the front and back pieces together. I'll place the back piece on the front piece, right side touching, head over to the sewing machine to stitch using the allowance I left for it while cutting, and I will stitch the lining the same way. So after stitching, this is what I have, and this is what my main fabric looks like. And the next thing to do is to create casing for the boning by running a stitch on each seam. Now the wideness of your casing depends on the size of your boning. This is my boning, and the casing I will create will be wide enough for my boning to pass through. And if you want your boning to be on both sides of your seam, all you have to do is to open up your seam and create casing on both sides. Here I already created casing for the boning, and the next thing to do is use lining to turn the top of the main fabric as well as the side. I'll place the lining on the main fabric right side facing, then locate the side of the lining and pin it against the side of the main fabric. And this is how I'll be stitching it using 1/2 inch measurements. I will also stitch the side like so. After stitching, I turned the lining to the wrong side and gave it a good press. You can see how neat it's looking. The next thing to do is to trim off the excess lining at the hem. At the center backs, boning will also be inserted, so I'll mark where the boning will be so as to create casing there. I will run a stitch on each line to serve as the bone casing. Then boning will be inserted there as well as the last space, but the middle space is where the eyelet will be placed, and I'll do the same thing to the other center back. Alright guys, this is what I have after running a stitch on each line I marked earlier, and this is a closer look at the wrong side. The next thing to do now is to insert boning into each casing. For my boning, I'm going to use paper tape to cover the edge so it won't poke through my fabric. Then I will insert it into the bone casing, and I'll make sure the boning does not reach the hem of my fabric. At least it will be 1 inch before the hem of my fabric. Then I will also cover the edge before I insert the boning completely into the casing. I will insert the boning into the rest of the casing off camera and come back to show us what it looks like. At this point, I already inserted the boning into the rest of the casing, and when I was done, I gave it a good press so it will lay properly. The next thing to do is to finish the hem of the corset, and I already cut out a piece for that. I'll place it at the hem, making sure about ½ inch is outside. I'll wrap it around the hem like so, then pin it down, and this is how I'll stitch this piece all around the hem. I will cut off the excess, making sure to leave about ½ inch that will be used to wrap the hem like I did at this other end. After stitching the piece to the hem of my corset, this is what I have. The next thing I'll do is to turn it to the wrong side and fold it twice. Then head over to the sewing machine to stitch it down, and I'll be stitching it all round. So this is what the hem of my corset looks like after stitching. The last thing to do here is to fix the eyelet on the space I left for it earlier. This is what my corset looks like after fixing the eyelet, and this is the rope I'll be using for the lace up. And with that, we've come to the end of this video. Thanks for watching, guys. If you find this tutorial helpful, kindly hit on the like button and subscribe to my channel if you are yet to, and I'll see you in my next one.